Hi, everyone.
Greetings again. In the last segment on Revelation, which was part 5, we looked at Revelation 14, ended off with the description of the harvest, which many commentators think of as a single harvest, a harvest of judgment, but when you look more closely at it, you realize that the harvest here seems to be a combination of the harvesting of the saints and the harvesting of the tares here on earth. So there it connects to the harvest of the vintage, that is the treading of the winepress in Revelation 14, seems to connect directly to the harvest of wheat and tares in the parable of the wheat and tares, Matthew 13. So check that out if you haven't already. We did put links to those sections that seem to be most relevant to Revelation 14 in the last video on chapter 14. That was part 5. We ended with another problem from the Watchtower perspective in 14 is the geographical locations. It says the winepress is trodden outside the city. What city? There's 2 cities mentioned, Zion and Babylon in the context. And then there's the space reference, that is the distance of 1,600 furlongs, which happens to be somewhere between 180 and 200 miles, most likely, in ancient measure, as well as modern. And a lot of the commentators think it no coincidence that that is the exact length of the promised land. So the bringing together of the armies in the context, that the horses' bridles are mentioned, the fact that the vintage is trodden outside the city now links it to this only text where Armageddon is directly mentioned, and that is in Revelation 16 verse 16. So let's read the text, the naked text, that is the text all by itself first, before we go into what the Watchtower is still saying about that specific text on Armageddon.
And they gathered them together to the place that is called in Hebrew Har-Mageddon.
The only reference in the Bible to this place by name, and the Watchtower trains you to, first of all, miss the word place.
Yeah.
And miss the reference to the Hebrew. Well, this is not a Hebrew word here, it's a Greek word, Armageddon. Mm. Why the reference to the Hebrew, unless it's to somehow clue you into the Jewish context of all of this? But leave that aside for now, the context issue. Let's just read what they have to say.
Mm-hmm. I guess the one question I'd have is, who are they in that text, right?
Yeah, there's a they and a them again.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
What does the Watchtower say about all of that? So we're going to go first of all to Revelation, its grand climax at hand. This is page 232 and paragraphs 31 to 33.
The need for Christians to stay awake becomes even more pressing as the next verse of Revelation comes closer to fulfillment. And then they quote the one we just read, Revelation 16:16, but they have some square brackets within the text to explain what they think it means. And they, the expressions inspired by demons, gathered them, the earthly kings or rulers, together to the place that is called in Hebrew Har-Mageddon. This name, more commonly rendered Armageddon, occurs only once in the Bible, but it has fired mankind's imagination. World leaders have warned of a possible nuclear Armageddon. Armageddon has been linked also with the ancient city of Megiddo, the site of many decisive battles in Bible times, and some religious leaders have therefore speculated that the final war on earth will take place in that limited area. In this, they are far wide of the truth. The name Armageddon means Mountain of Megiddo, but rather than being a literal place, it represents the world's situation into which all nations are gathered in opposition to Jehovah God, and where he will finally destroy them. This is global in extent. It is similar to the great winepress of the anger of God and the low plain of the decision, or the low plain of Jehoshaphat, where the nations are gathered for execution by Jehovah. It is also related to the soil of Israel, where the satanic armies of Gog of Magog are destroyed, and that location between the Grand Sea and the holy mountain of decoration, where the king of the north comes all the way to his end at the hands of Michael, the great prince. And there's lots of scripture references within the last paragraph there. When the nations have been maneuvered into this situation by the croaking propaganda originating with Satan and his earthly agents, it will be time for the seventh angel to pour out the final bowl of the anger of God.
So while dismissing the two alternate explanations which are usually applied to this word Armageddon in the general culture, in the popular culture you've got Armageddon linked to nuclear holocaust, which would be more or less like the Watchtowers, except the God part is missing, right? It's a world holocaust. Whereas they admit the second explanation, the one that is favored by most Bible scholars and most Christians, having some local application, that is also gone, and yet the chain of references they attach to it, which we'll get to in a minute, have all of these geographical
locations in them.
Specifics.
But it's also stated with such absolute. In this they are far wide of the truth. It represents. It's just stated so factually.
Categorically.
Like we know.
We know because of the others being unacceptable explanations, right? So the first one, nuclear Armageddon, well, that's a world take on this expression. That's what people who don't know the Bible believe. But most of the people who do know the Bible well take the second explanation. It's got to do with not God's final war, as they say here, though, because most of the people who believe in a local application of Armageddon, a geographical specifics that are some of them even mentioned here. Most of those people don't believe it's the final war, but rather the prelude to the millennium. And then there's another battle after the millennium itself, also referred to as the War of Gog of Magog in the book of Revelation. But I find it fascinating that they twice here use the expression propaganda to describe the problem with the other explanations. Whereas here you have the page before when they actually picture on page 231 these events. They have literal armies, literal cannons and tanks and rockets. And then they have, of course, the symbolic they take to be symbolic, the beasts, two different beasts, the dragon, of course, and the three frogs. So this problem of what to make symbolic and what not, well, here the context helps you because it does call this place Armageddon, linking it, as we said before, to a Hebrew expression, which they then admit, as they say in the middle of paragraph 31, is linked in the Old Testament anyway to the city of Megiddo, site of many decisive battles in Bible times. We'll get to that in the next video. More detail about that in their Insight book. But then, like you said, stating these people who take the local applications are far wide of the truth.
Right. And then go right into, with no proof, this represents a world situation.
But they do have six.
Because we say so.
6 proof texts. I guess you'd assume they're proof texts.
Yeah.
For calling it a world situation that are then linked to it. And those proof texts, let's look a little more closely at them. Jeremiah 25, they cite only 3 verses there. If you look at Jeremiah 25, for this global extent of Armageddon, you also see a bunch of place names. So check the entire context. I think if you do something with this video, follow it up, read the entirety of Jeremiah 25. We'll probably get to that in a future video. Then they have their classic proof text from Daniel 2:44, which admittedly is vague. It is a verse that you probably have memorized if you're a witness.
That's the one I always use.
The destruction of the kingdoms by God's kingdom, right? But then they have, for some reason, references to the low plane of decision the low plain of Jehoshaphat. This is not good for their argument. So in a future video, we want to look more closely at Joel 3, cited here. They've only cited 2 verses, verses 12 and 14, the low plain of Jehoshaphat. But that's actually a place outside Jerusalem. They've also cited Revelation 14:19. We dealt with that in the prior video. Only 1 verse again. But then they've, for some reason, said it's related to the soil of Israel, where the satanic armies of Magog are destroyed. And then they've linked it not only to that passage in Ezekiel 36, only 5 verses of context there.
38.
38 rather.
38. Yeah.
And if you look at the original from 36 to 39, you realize all of the context in Ezekiel 36 to 39.
It's not going to help the argument.
It's not going to help the argument because it's all about the soil of Israel and restored Israel. But then they link that to Daniel chapter 11, verse 45 through 12:1. Only 2 verses from Daniel. We've done videos on this before, so we'll link to those, where you see the problem. If you look at those texts in Daniel, there's 7 place names. Not just the ones they've itemized here. The Grand Sea, which they don't tell you is the actual name for the Mediterranean in those days. And the Holy Mountain of Decoration, which all the Daniel commentaries tell you is Mount Zion. And beyond that, the first place designated in, if you read the context in Daniel 11 and 12, is the beautiful land. It's all about the invasion of a land by what you admit to be the king of the north, who in most of the interpretations that I've read on Daniel is linked to the Antichrist. So there's nothing here about a personal Antichrist, which after all has been the belief of the church from the beginning, and the link of the Antichrist to the king of the north. Even the idea, though, that it's either a symbolic battle or it's a literal battle, and they choose, of course, the symbolic.
The argument that I always remember that was used, that I used, was this was a small area, and so it couldn't possibly have this complete destruction of the world happen there. Armageddon couldn't happen there because it was too small a space. But then when I start thinking about, and I'm no expert on war, but when the wars happened, the First World War and the Second World War, we called them world wars, and yet there were locations attached to
Specific places for battles.
Yeah, and then some battles are more marked, because it's a major victory or disaster.
Yeah.
So there's no problem with everybody else thinking, that world wars, they have a location where they meet, and sometimes it's just representatives meet and talk in a specific location.
Who's gathered here, by the way? Well, they've even said it's the earthly kings or rulers.
Yeah, not every army and all the people.
Right. We'll get into that more when we discuss Zechariah 12, which they don't cite here, and Zechariah 14. But I couldn't help but think, as you said that, upon Napoleon invaded this area and invaded Egypt. And he actually traveled through this area of the world. When you think of Napoleon, you think of 2 geographical locations that identified with the famous battles he fought and lost, Trafalgar and Waterloo. And yet Waterloo and Trafalgar, as much as they've come to mean more than just a battle, they actually were battles in locations, and they therefore the names are geographical locations which have come to have significance beyond themselves. When you say Napoleon met his Waterloo, you're not just talking about the battle, but you are talking about a place, and a place where a battle took place. So even in the way we do these word associations in our culture, we don't dislocate the place name from the application or the historical application of it.
Even if it ends up having greater significance,
And when it comes to a passage like Daniel 11:12, you've got to look at the technicalities. As we said in one of our videos, which we will link, the devil is in the details, and I would go further and put a positive spin on it, God is in the details.
Mm-hmm.
God's agenda is in the details, if you look at Daniel 11 and 12 specifically.
Mm.
And we'll look more at what the Watchtowers had to say about this in, of course, their famous reference book, The Insight on the Scriptures, which itself is a revision of the Aid to Bible Understanding, in the next video.
Okay.
See you next time.
Mm-hmm.